Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The Okoro compound sat on the western side of Ojumba, not far from where the red earth began to turn golden beneath the weight of the setting sun. The house itself wasn't the largest in the town, nor the most decorated, but it had something that made people pause, a strange kind of peace that clung to it like a familiar scent. Its walls were the color of aging ivory, kissed with dust and sunlight, and the windows, framed in old mahogany, open to the kind of breeze that always smelled like rain was nearby. At the front, a small gate creaked when pushed, not from neglect, but as though it had grown old alongside the family it guarded. The path that led from the gate to the front door had been worn smooth by years of footsteps, laughter-filled ones, barefoot ones, weary ones. And then there was the door itself, painted in a blue so bold it seemed to pulse with memory. That door had seen things, arguments hushed too soon, prayers whispered too late, meals that healed and silences that hurt. Even when Martha Okoro washed it with soapy water and a sponge every Saturday morning, the color never faded. They said it was the kind of blue only grief could leave behind. People didn't say much, but they watched, and in Ojumba, watching was often more powerful than speaking. Martha's hands were always moving. Some women aged from the inside out, but Martha was the opposite. Her spirit remained youthful, elastic, quiet, but her hands told a different story. They had calluses not from suffering, but from building a home, a reputation, and a history. Each morning she bent at the waist, broom in hand, sweeping her compound not just of leaves, but of memories, of yesterdays. Her wrappers were always tied tightly above her hips, and her hair, always in neat cornrows, smelled faintly of coconut oil and faith. Martha believed in routine the way others believed in medicine. She woke at 5. She watered the okra and sent leaves before the sun could. She boiled water for tea, even when she had no appetite, and she spoke to her late mother each morning, not with words, but with her eyes cast skyward, nodding as though listening to answers. There was a stillness to her, but not the kind that came from idleness. It was the stillness of someone who had mastered waiting. Waiting for the kettle to whistle, for the clothes to dry, for the children who never came, and for the man who was often present but rarely near. People in Ojumba often said a woman's kitchen spoke louder than her mouth, and Martha's kitchen was a hymn. The wooden shelves groaned under the weight of neatly stacked pots. Jars of ground crayfish, ojari, and pepper lined up like soldiers waiting for instruction. The firewood behind the house was always dry. Her knives, though old, were sharp enough to slice silence itself. Her meals were simple but sacred, each one made with fingers that stirred with purpose, with heartbeats that counted not minutes, but memories. On that evening, when Ebenezer announced the trip, Martha was slicing onions, the knife moving steadily through their layered bodies. She didn't flinch. Not when the onions made her eyes water, and not when her husband, standing stiff by the doorway, mentioned he would be gone for just 2 weeks. The words didn't surprise her. They hovered in the air like dust motes, slow and expected. She wiped her eyes, nodded, and continued slicing. She asked no questions, not because she didn't care, but because her heart already held the answers. In Ojumba, a woman always knew when her home had become a house. The air changes. The walls breathe differently. That night, Martha lay beside him, but the distance between their bodies was more than a mattress could measure. She stared at the ceiling while the fan above whirred like an impatient clock. She could hear his breathing, deep and even, as if peace was something he had packed in his suitcase. Her fingers moved slowly over the bedsheet, tracing invisible patterns. She wanted to speak, to ask him where his mind had been these past months, why his hands had stopped reaching for hers, why his prayers no longer ended in amen when she said them aloud. But her throat refused. Instead, she closed her eyes and reached for the only comfort she had ever known, Scripture. "The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace," she whispered, barely audible, from Exodus 14, verse 14. And with that, she turned to the wall, letting her silence bloom around her like a shroud. He slept soundly, and in her silence, she realized something. Sometimes the loudest alarm is the one that rings only inside your chest. The morning after Ebenezer and Lillian arrived in Igara, the air felt thick with a kind of heat that didn't come from the sun. It was the heat of pretense, of secret lives stepping into borrowed daylight. Igara was a quieter town than Ojumba, dustier too, with roads that curled like question marks and trees that bowed their heads like they knew too much. Ebenezer had rented a modest bungalow tucked behind a bakery, far from prying eyes, far from judgment. The caretaker handed him the keys without asking many questions. Money often closes mouths. The moment they stepped inside, Lillian kicked off her heels and flung her handbag onto the couch like someone claiming territory. The place smelled faintly of paint, garlic, and someone else's loneliness. She stretched like a cat, humming a song Ebenezer didn't know. He watched her from the doorway, his suitcase still in hand, unsure if he was meant to feel victorious or hollow. The ride had been long, full of small talk and shared glances, but now that the silence had returned, it sat between them like a third person. He cleared his throat. She asked if there was a wineglass. He walked into the kitchen. She followed. For a man who had run from the quiet of his home, he found the silence here even louder. By the third day, the rhythm of their pretend paradise had taken shape. Lillian rose late, often wrapping herself in the bedsheet like a queen waiting to be attended to. She called Ebenezer Ebby in that high-pitched, teasing tone that always felt like a joke with no punchline. She wore silk robes that clung to her, always choosing red, as if color alone could sustain excitement. He cooked most mornings, frying eggs and yam, watching the oil hiss while she scrolled through her phone. There were moments, short, weightless ones, when her laughter filled the room, and he almost forgot what he had left behind. But even in those moments, her joy felt like something bought, not grown. Lillian's conversation often floated toward her hair appointments, the clothes she hadn't packed, the boredom she battled like it was a sickness. Ebenezer would nod, grunt, and sometimes smile, but inside he felt himself shrinking. There was no talk of Martha, of course. Her name was a locked room he wouldn't open. But sometimes, when Lillian leaned in to kiss him, he could smell onions and firewood, not her perfume. His body was here, but his memory wore an apron and spoke softly. Each night, as the moon leaked through the half-open curtains, Ebenezer would lie beside Lillian and feel as though he had climbed into someone else's life and didn't know how to climb back out. One afternoon, after returning from the market where she had haggled with too much force and too little patience, Lillian dropped a bag of tomatoes on the kitchen counter and said, "I don't know how your people live here. Everything is dry. The women stare like they've never seen lipstick before." Her voice was sharp, dismissive, coated with the kind of arrogance that comes from never needing to belong. Ebenezer looked up from the newspaper he wasn't reading, and for a brief moment the room stiffened. He didn't answer. What could he say? That Ojumba women had smiled with their eyes and spoke with their silences? That Martha had once given up her only wrapper to clothe the neighbor's daughter after a fire? That simplicity was not poverty, and grace did not need decoration? But the words never came. Instead, he stood up, walked into the backyard, and stared at the fence until the ache in his chest settled. Lillian didn't follow. She went to paint her nails instead. The space between them stretched longer each day. She wanted a man who laughed more. He wanted a woman who listened without asking for more. And though neither of them said it, they both knew something precious was missing. The strange thing about pretending is that it demands more energy than truth, and Ebenezer was growing tired. By the end of the second week, Ebenezer found himself avoiding the mirror. He shaved less, prayed less, and spoke only when spoken to. Guilt had found a chair inside him and refused to leave. Every corner of the bungalow reminded him of something he wished he could undo. The kitchen sink, that was where Martha once sang to herself while peeling yam. The hallway, it echoed like their bedroom used to when she prayed late at night. Even Lillian's laughter began to sting. It was too sharp, too loud, too unfamiliar. He began waking up early, stepping outside before she stirred. He'd sit under the mango tree in the compound and trace circles in the dirt with his slipper. The birds in Igora didn't sound like the ones back home. Everything here felt like a borrowed life, and in the quiet of those mornings he began to feel something shift. He missed Martha, not just her presence, but her weight in his world, the way she held silence like a sacred object, the way her spirit didn't need noise to be felt. That morning he whispered a verse he hadn't said in years. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, from Proverbs 28 verse 13. Then he added nothing more. He just sat there, head bowed, as if waiting for someone to call his name. The sun that rose over Ojumba that morning wore a dull face, as if it too had sensed something unwanted returning to its soil. The wind refused to sing, and even the chickens in Mama Ifeoma's yard clucked half-heartedly. The road that led to the Okoro compound was dry and cracked, a thin snake of dust slithering along the edges, as if to warn rather than welcome. Ebenezer's taxi pulled into the street with a cough of exhaust, the tires crunching over gravel like footsteps disturbing a grave. He had barely spoken a word throughout the ride, only answering questions from the driver with nods or disinterested hums. Lillian sat beside him, chewing gum with the careless rhythm of someone expecting a victory parade. She applied lip gloss as they turned the final bend, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You never told me it was this quiet," she said, peering out the window as if Ojumba's silence was a personal insult. Ebenezer didn't respond. His fingers gripped his knee, tapping lightly. The closer they got, the heavier his chest became, as though some unseen weight was being dropped on his shoulders with each passing second. When the car finally came to a stop in front of the blue gate, he hesitated. Something in the air was wrong. It smelled too clean. The trees were still, and the birds watched from branches like judges in court. He stepped out, and the taxi drove off with a sigh. Lillian followed, dragging her suitcase over the uneven ground. "Your people sleep late here," she mumbled, not noticing the way Ebenezer's gaze was fixed on the front door, already ajar. It wasn't the kind of open door that welcomed, it was the kind that warned. A door left open not out of forgetfulness, but with intention. He walked toward it slowly, his steps uneven, his heartbeat rising in a slow crescendo. The house looked unfamiliar, emptied not by theft, but by someone who knew exactly what to take and what to leave behind. The curtains, the ones Martha had sewn from Ankara fabric 5 years ago, were gone. The clay pots from the veranda were no longer sitting by the windows. The pair of sandals that always lay neatly near the mat, hers, had vanished as well. Lillian pushed past him, her heels clicking like an offense in the silence. "Did she travel?" she asked, walking straight into the sitting room, glancing around like a visitor expecting to be entertained. Ebenezer said nothing. He stepped into the house like a man who had forgotten how to enter his own story. The living room, once filled with the warm scent of palm oil and lemongrass, was hollow now, like a drum that had been beaten too long. He looked to the right, where the family photos used to hang. All gone. Only the faint outlines remained on the wall, like shadows of memories now withdrawn. His eyes drifted to the center table, where something white caught his attention, a single envelope, thick and square, resting calmly on the wood like a still tongue. His name was written on it, in Martha's unmistakable script. Not in anger, not in haste, just in finality. He did not open it immediately. His hands hovered over it like he was afraid touching it would burn him. Lillian stood behind him now, her voice flattening. So she's not here. You said she'd be gone for 2 weeks? Still, he didn't speak. He stared at the letter as if expecting it to speak first. The walls of the house began to breathe again, but this time with a different rhythm. There was no warmth in the air, no lingering smell of food, no evidence of the life he had known. It was not just Martha who had left. It was her presence, her spirit, her rhythm. The house felt abandoned in a way that couldn't be undone with apologies. Even the floor creaked differently under his weight, as though mourning its true occupant. Ebenezer stepped back from the table, rubbing his palms together, breathing like a man trying to stay upright on a shifting boat. His mind raced, but there was no one to argue with, no one to accuse, no one to beg. Just the silence, and silence can be a cruel interpreter of guilt. Lillian walked into the kitchen, opened the cupboard doors, and scoffed. She even took the salt, she said with a sneer. But Ebenezer didn't follow her. He stood in the center of the room, his mouth dry, the air too thick to swallow. Something had changed in him. A realization. A reckoning. Not loud, not immediate, but a creeping certainty that a door had closed, one that may never open again. He left the house and walked slowly around the compound, his eyes scanning for signs that perhaps he had missed something. The neighbors were watching. They always watched. From curtains pulled slightly aside, from front porches where hands fanned at flies that didn't matter. It wasn't out of spite, it was the way Ojumba learned its stories, with silence and observation. Mama Chica, the oldest widow on the lane, was the only one who dared speak. She stood at her gate, her head wrapped in a faded blue scarf, her hands resting calmly on her belly. When Ebenezer passed her, she didn't greet him. She simply said she left like mist at dawn. No noise, no trace. But she left. Then she walked back inside, closing her door with the soft click of finality. Ebenezer stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the compound, the dust curling gently around his shoes. Lillian came out of the house, her voice louder now, sharper. What is this? Is this some game? Where did she go? Ebenezer didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have answers. Not for her, not for himself. The sky above Ojumba began to darken, even though the sun had not yet set, and as the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry leaves and something older, Ebenezer finally sat on the front steps and held the letter in his hands, but still he did not open it. Ebenezer sat on the edge of the bed that no longer felt like his own, the letter lying across his lap like a stone he could not carry and could not drop. The room was dim, though it was midday. The curtain above the window fluttered, casting flickers of sunlight onto the tiled floor in broken patterns, as if even the light itself hesitated to stay in one place. He stared at his name on the envelope for a long time, not because he didn't recognize it, but because of the weight behind it, how it had been written with a hand that had loved him, prayed for him, waited for him. Now it had written to leave. The script was deliberate, graceful, not rushed. Martha's handwriting had always been elegant, almost too soft for a world so sharp. Ebenezer finally broke the seal, each tear in the paper echoing louder than his heartbeat. Inside were 3 folded sheets. He unfolded the first, slowly, like one might uncover a wound that had already begun to rot. Her words did not cut with anger, they wept with resignation. She had written not to accuse, but to unburden. There was no fire in her sentences, only ash. I loved you as far as a woman can love, it began. I loved you past your forgetting, past your silence, past your distance. But now I must remember myself. The more he read, the colder the room seemed to grow. There were no direct confrontations in her message, no pointed fingers, but every line bore the weight of absence and endurance. Martha spoke of quiet dinners, where the sound of his spoon in the plate was the only music, of Sundays, where she sat beside him in church while his mind wandered to other altars. Nights where she slept facing the wall, not out of anger, but because she had learned that back-to-back breathing was better than conversations that went nowhere. She wrote of the day she stopped asking where he was going, and the day she stopped listening for his return. She wrote about love not as something that dies, but as something that slowly forgets how to stay alive. Her words moved like slow water, not rushing, not pleading, simply flowing toward a sea that no longer held space for her reflection. Ebenezer wiped his face with the back of his hand, only then realizing tears had crept down his cheeks like thieves escaping from shame. He folded the letter again, but the words had already settled into the walls. "You broke something I can't explain," she wrote near the end, "and I don't hate you. I just cannot keep sweeping broken glass barefoot." He found the second sheet tucked beneath the first, slightly smaller, its paper thicker, an old stationery she had used in their first year of marriage. There was something cruel about its softness now. That sheet contained no narrative, only instructions. A key had been attached with thread, a small silver one, the kind used for drawers or small gates. She had returned the house to him with a kind of grace that frightened him. No revenge, no lawyers, no possessions withheld, just peace and distance. She wrote about her father's plot of land by the river Oji, how he used to sit there every Sunday with a Bible on his lap and a bottle of malt beside him. She left the key for Ebenezer, telling him the land was legally his now, should he ever need it. "You may choose to build something on it," she wrote, "but I hope this time you will build something with truth." That sentence wrapped itself around his throat. It wasn't a blessing. It wasn't a curse. It was simply hope placed carefully before him like a seed in dry soil. She ended the letter with scripture. "If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Psalm 11 verse 3. And beneath it, her name, signed fully, Martha Okoro, as if to remind him of who she had been and who she had chosen to stop being for him. He sat for a long time without moving. Outside, the evening had begun to tiptoe across the compound, touching the walls with gold as the sun leaned westward. Lillian had grown quiet, likely sensing that the atmosphere inside the house no longer welcomed her usual noise. She lingered in the hallway, but didn't speak. She peeked into the room once, her perfume arriving before she did, but Ebenezer didn't acknowledge her. He placed the letter back inside the envelope, almost reverently, and tucked it into the drawer beside the bed. He rose and went to the mirror. The man who stared back at him looked like someone who had spent years shaving off layers of himself until there was nothing but a suit and a name. His eyes, once full of ambition, now held the haunted emptiness of someone who knew exactly when he had lost everything and why. He wanted to speak, to summon words, to explain something, anything, but no sound came. Silence was all that would sit with him now. Lillian finally spoke, arms crossed. "So what now? You're going to chase her?" He turned to her slowly, as if waking from a bad dream. His voice came dry, almost foreign. "She left me before her body left this house." And in that moment the air seemed to sag under the truth of it. Lillian said nothing. Her presence, once thrilling, now stood like a misplaced object, wrong in its time, wrong in its place. The days that followed were shapeless things, like smoke drifting across the face of a mirror. Time seemed to move without rhythm inside the Okoro compound. It was as if the house, once held together by the heartbeat of its former mistress, had now lost the will to function. The mornings began without meaning. Ebenezer would wake not because he was rested, but because sleep no longer respected his mind. His dreams had become fragmented, images of Martha standing at a doorway, always about to speak but never saying a word. He moved about the house with the slow drag of someone trying to make sense of a language he once understood but had long forgotten. The chair in the corner, the one she always used to sit on to show ground nuts, remained untouched. Her Bible, though gone, had left a ghost imprint on the wooden shelf, and he found himself staring at that empty space far too often. The kettle still whistled, but the sound had lost its comfort. The floor creaked, but instead of memory, it carried accusation. He no longer turned on the radio in the mornings. Martha used to hum along to the gospel songs that played before the 7 a.m. news, and now the silence after sunrise felt like a wound that wouldn't clot. Even Lillian, who had once filled the space with restless energy, grew quiet. She no longer strutted through the house like a queen in borrowed territory. Her voice became thinner, less sure of itself, and one morning, without packing much, she slipped out of the house just after dawn. Ebenezer heard the gate creak, but didn't go out. He didn't stop her, didn't ask questions. He simply sat there, spooning plain pap into his mouth, chewing nothing, tasting nothing. Left alone, he began to roam. He wandered the streets of Ojumba like a man trying to remember how to belong. He no longer walked with the firm stride of the respected accountant he once was. His shoulders drooped a little. His clothes hung heavier on him, and even the shine on his shoes began to dull. The people noticed, but Ojumba was not a town that shouted. It was a place of silent watchers and slow forgiveness. Children no longer ran to greet him. The greetings of elders came less often, and when they did, they were short, cautious, curious. One afternoon, Ebenezer found himself standing outside the compound of Papa Ikadef, the retired schoolteacher who had once praised his diligence in the village meeting hall. The old man watched him from the veranda and simply said, "You look like a man who drank from his own cup and is now shocked it tasted bitter." Ebenezer didn't answer. He only nodded, lowered his eyes, and walked away. On another evening, he wandered into the churchyard of St. Mary's. The bell had just rung for evening prayers, but he didn't go in. Instead, he sat on one of the stone benches outside, watching the old priest sweep fallen leaves from the walkway. The priest, noticing him, paused and walked over. His voice was soft but steady. "When God removes a covering," he said, "even the sun you used to enjoy starts to burn." Then he placed his hand gently on Ebenezer's shoulder and walked away without waiting for a reply. It was the kind of wisdom that didn't demand discussion. That night, Ebenezer stayed outside long after the lights inside the church had gone out, trying to pray but finding only silence. It wasn't that God was not listening. It was that he no longer knew what to ask. Even in his attempts to resume routine, nothing tasted the same. He tried to make a goosey soup one evening, reaching for the spices as he had seen Martha do countless times. He pounded the melon seeds, stirred in the palm oil, and even fried the onions until they danced in the pot, but the taste was wrong. Bitter in places, bland in others. He sat at the table with the plate in front of him, the steam rising like unanswered questions. He took a bite and almost choked on the lump in his throat. He dropped the spoon and rested his elbows on the table, pressing his palms to his eyes. For years he had taken for granted the invisible hands that had made his life easier, the meals ready when he returned from work, the clothes ironed and folded, the prayers whispered over his shoes as he left the house. Those small graces, which he had mistaken for ordinary, now haunted every inch of his daily life. Even the scent of the house had changed. Where once there was the comforting smell of fried plantain, fresh soap, and lavender oil, now there lingered the faint odor of loneliness, a kind of scent that didn't cling to fabric but to memory. At night, the bed no longer warmed, not because of the absence of a body beside him, but because the piece that used to cover the room like a blanket had been folded away and taken with her. He tried more than once to write something in a notebook, perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology, but the pen always hovered, and no words came. Eventually he remembered the letter and the key, the land by the river. It took him days to build the courage to go there. When he finally did, it was not with fanfare or hope. He simply wore his oldest shirt, folded the letter into his back pocket, and walked the narrow footpath that led toward the river Aji. The trees on either side had grown wild, their branches touching like they were whispering secrets above his head. Birds called out from the canopy, and dry leaves crunched beneath his steps. When he arrived, he found the plot untouched, save for the wild grasses that had claimed it in his absence. The air was different here, less judgmental, almost expectant. He stood at the center, turned slowly, taking it in. The river flowed not far off, murmuring softly like a lullaby from a forgotten childhood. He sat on a rock beneath an udala tree and unfolded the letter again. "Build something true," she had written. He read the line over and over, letting it burrow into him like seed. He didn't know what to build yet. Not a house, not a shrine, not a monument, but something. Anything that could begin to replace what he had lost. Something that could speak when he no longer could. And for the first time in weeks, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, teach me to start again." A full year passed, not loudly, not quickly, but with the slow movement of shadows across familiar walls. The house with the blue door, once a haven of warmth and quiet companionship, had become something else entirely, a monument to absence. Over time, the paint began to peel near the bottom edge of the door, not all at once, but in small, flaking curves that seemed to mimic the slow unraveling of the man who still lived behind it. Ebenezer kept the house clean, but it was the kind of cleanliness that came from fear of decay rather than pride. He no longer played music, no longer answered the calls of old friends. He moved through the rooms deliberately, like someone who didn't trust the floor to hold his weight. The compound grew quieter than it had ever been, not just because of the lack of conversation, but because the kind of silence that lived there now was rooted deep in the bones of the place. His movements became mechanical: boil water, sweep the floor, sit outside, stare at nothing. Some days he would walk the perimeter of the compound for hours, as if trying to understand the outline of his own solitude. The neighbors still watched, but now with something close to pity. They had stopped asking questions. In Ojumba, some stories became unspeakable by virtue of how they ended, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with a silence that was louder than thunder. Far away, in a quieter town called Antej, Martha was relearning joy in its smallest forms. She had rented a modest room near the market, a place that smelled of ginger and soap, with a small window where the sun filtered in every morning like a promise. She had started a small herbal shop, nothing grand, but sincere. People came to her not just for healing leaves and roots, but because of the way she listened. Her presence, once buried under years of being overlooked, now stood tall and unafraid. She wore her hair differently now, shorter, freer. Her laughter, once bottled tightly within her, now came without shame or reason. She didn't speak of the past, not because she was avoiding it, but because it no longer dictated her days. Sometimes, when she swept the shop floor in the evening, she would pause and look out into the street, her heart still and quiet. There was no bitterness in her, only the kind of softness that grows around well-healed wounds. On Sundays, she sat in the back row at the little church beside the bakery, humming hymns with closed eyes and open hands. The women in the market called her Mama Leaf, but the children simply called her Auntie Martha, and followed her around for the free guava she kept in her woven basket. And though she never said it aloud, she knew that walking away had not just been an escape, it had been a rebirth. What she had left behind no longer defined her. What she had walked toward was still unfolding, day by gentle day. Back in Ojumba, Ebenezer began to visit the land Martha had left him more frequently. What started as quiet visits soon became longer stays. He brought with him a small hoe and a plastic bucket, nothing impressive. At first he only cleared the grass near the river's edge, unsure of what he was doing. Then, slowly, he began to plant. 1 mango tree, then 2 pawpaw seedlings. Then a row of scent leaf. He worked alone, speaking only to the soil, and sometimes to God. There were days the sun burned his neck raw, days the rains nearly washed away his efforts, but he kept returning. Not to build a house, not to claim ownership, but to redeem a piece of himself in the only way he knew how. People who passed by the path would sometimes stop and greet him, unsure what to say. They had heard things. The story had floated like wind, never confirmed, never denied. But now they saw him hunched in the dirt, sweating and silent, and they nodded in respect. It was clear he wasn't building for show. He never hired workers, never fenced the land. He just planted, watered, waited. In the evenings, he sat beneath the udala tree, watching the river whisper its old songs. In time, he brought a small wooden bench and left it there, rain or shine. Some said he spoke to the tree. Others said he prayed. No one interrupted. And though the fruit trees had yet to bear anything worth picking, he remained patient, knowing some seasons are about planting regret so future forgiveness can grow. One day, Ebenezer brought with him a worn journal. It had no title, no design, just rough brown pages filled with untidy writing. He sat on the bench under the tree and began to write, not letters to Martha, not sermons or confessions, but small pieces of memory. The first entry simply read, "She used to hum when she ironed. I never noticed the tune. I wish I had." Each page carried one thought, one truth, written not for redemption but for remembrance. He did not intend to show it to anyone. It was not a plea. It was a record, a way to remind himself of who he had been and what it had cost. Days turned to weeks, and the journal thickened with lines soaked in quiet sorrow and slow healing. He read the Bible again, this time not to quote it, but to understand it. One verse stayed with him, "Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit." Psalm 51 verse 12. He whispered it each time he watered the ground. Not in a hurry, not with demands, just with hope that one day something good would grow again. When the dust had finally settled in his heart, he no longer felt the need to run. He had stopped looking for Martha's footsteps in the sand. He had started walking his own. If this story touched your heart, then it has done what it was meant to do. Let it remind you that silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes, silence is where healing begins. Sometimes, it is the answer itself. Never wait until the door is left open in finality before you learn how to value presence. Don't let your pride speak so loudly that you can't hear love packing its bags quietly in the corner. If you are loved by someone who shows up for you daily in small, unspoken ways, treasure them. Respect the ones who pray for you when you're not watching, the ones who cover your name in grace, not gossip. And if you've hurt someone, don't wait for life to punish you to realize it. Seek forgiveness, and above all, forgive yourself. If you are Martha in this story, may you find peace in your decision to walk away and power in the quiet dignity of your healing. If you are Ebenezer, may you find the strength to rebuild with truth, not to impress, but to redeem. There is still life after loss, and still grace after failure. Because healing is not just for those who were broken, it's for those who broke something too. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.